The chamber of the Galactic Council loomed vast and indifferent, a cathedral of polished stone and silent judgment. Lines of alien delegates stretched across the curved tiers, their collective gaze focused on the center podium where the desperate plea had just concluded. The representative of the threatened species, a frail figure draped in tattered ceremonial cloth, stood trembling, awaiting the verdict. A long pause followed, punctuated only by the soft hum of the council's environmental systems. The councillors exchanged glances, unreadable behind their various masks and visors. Some whispered, others remained statuesque. Then the voice of Consul Threx broke the silence, his tone devoid of sympathy. His elongated frame, draped in robes that shimmered like dark glass, leaned slightly forward, as if weighing the fate of those beneath him with detached curiosity. This matter falls beyond the Council's jurisdiction. The species in question has no standing within this chamber. A few heads nodded in solemn agreement, as if the extinction of an entire race was nothing more than an administrative inconvenience. Another consular representative, adorned in elaborate metallic robes etched with faint circuitry, leaned forward. His pale, mask-like face betrayed no emotion, save for the slight twitch of his mandibles as he spoke. If they are unable to defend their borders, then perhaps the sector would benefit from reorganization. Nature abhors weakness. Ripples of approval echoed across the assembly. From the rear of the chamber, the human chancellor, Giancarlo Banks, remained seated, his hands clasped before him. Deep lines carved across his stern face, his dark eyes reflecting the cold glow of the chamber lights, unreadable, yet weighted. His face betrayed no immediate emotion, though his eyes narrowed ever so slightly as he observed the proceedings. His aides shifted uneasily behind him. When the laughter of one delegate grew a fraction too loud, the chancellor finally rose. His movement was unhurried, deliberate. The council chamber quieted as all attention shifted to him. He stepped to the central podium, his footsteps measured but firm, the echo of his boots ringing against the cold stone. "The Galactic Council claims to stand for unity and order," the chancellor began, his voice calm but carrying an edge that scraped against the indifferent air. "Yet when a race stands at the precipice of annihilation, you offer nothing but indifference and hollow justifications." A murmur spread across the chamber. Threx straightened in his seat, his eyes narrowing. "This is not our concern," Threx intoned. "Their fate was sealed the moment they failed to—" The chancellor's gaze sharpened. "Failed to do what, Consul? Secure the protection of those with more guns?" The tension thickened. The chancellor swept his eyes across the assembly. "Humanity will not be complicit in this." His voice dropped but seemed to grow heavier. "We will not watch another civilization burn while we stand idle, shackled by bureaucracy." A ripple of unease coursed through the chamber. "I cast humanity's vote against this council's decision," the chancellor declared. Several delegates exchanged shocked glances. One rose to object, but the chancellor continued, silencing the protest, with nothing but the weight of his stare. "And as of this moment, we withdraw from deliberation. If you choose inaction, that is your burden to bear." He stepped down from the podium, the echo of his departure filling the silence that followed. Behind him, his aides exchanged hurried glances. One leaned in. "Sir, do you wish to convene with the council privately?" "No," the chancellor replied, his eyes fixed ahead. "Summon Admiral Russo. We'll do this ourselves." The aides nodded and peeled away, their footsteps quickening as they departed the chamber. The chancellor paused at the exit, glancing back once. The consuls and their ilk sat frozen in uncertainty, some casting their gazes down, others holding his in silent defiance. Let them watch, he thought. The doors sealed behind him with a resolute hiss. The private chamber aboard the human sector of the station hummed softly, the faint resonance of distant engines vibrating through the polished steel floors. Chancellor Giancarlo Banks stood with his back to the room, eyes fixed on the stars scattered beyond the wide viewport. He didn't turn when the door slid open. The footsteps behind him were measured but purposeful, 3 men entered, each clad in the dark uniforms of the United Earth Defense, UED. The insignias on their sleeves marked their rank, high enough to speak freely, but not high enough to question the Chancellor's command. "Sit," Banks ordered quietly. He could hear the rustle of fabric as they obeyed. Only then did he turn, his gaze sharp but steady. "You've seen the Council's reaction." His tone was flat, but the weight behind it pressed against the air. "We cannot expect assistance from them." Commodore Ellis, the eldest of the trio, leaned forward slightly. His face, lined from years of service, carried the weight of countless campaigns, and a faint scar traced his jawline, disappearing beneath the high collar of his uniform. His eyes, sharp but weary, betrayed nothing but focus. "You knew this would happen, sir. The Council won't move unless the threat lands at their doorstep." Banks's eyes narrowed. "And by then, millions will already be dead." Silence filled the chamber, the truth settling in the space between them. After a moment, Banks folded his hands behind his back. "We'll intervene, quietly. I need someone to lead the fleet." Ellis exhaled through his nose, casting a brief glance at the man seated to his right. "There's only one name that fits." Banks's gaze followed his. Across the table sat Admiral Nathan Russo, his expression impassive. The low glow of the console reflected faintly in the lines, etched into his weathered face. "I assume there's no need for ceremony," Russo said. His voice carried the rough edge of a man who had long abandoned pretense. Banks allowed himself a slight nod. "None." Ellis shifted in his seat. "You'll need a fleet and authorization." "You have both," Banks replied, his tone leaving no room for doubt. He stepped around the table, lowering himself into the empty seat at the head. "This isn't a campaign. It's protection, defensive operations only." His gaze locked onto Russo. "We intervene where the killing begins, and stop it. No provocations." Russo nodded once, understanding the nuance beneath the words. "We intercept, shield the civilians, and force them to negotiate, nothing more." "Correct." Banks's fingers tapped against the armrest. "I want a special fleet. Small, but capable. The Coalition cannot perceive this as aggression, but we need enough force to make them reconsider." Ellis cleared his throat. "I'll have a list of available vessels prepared by the hour." Russo glanced sideways at him. "Make it 20 minutes. The Commodore's brows lifted, but he nodded, rising smoothly from his chair. The remaining officer followed, offering a silent salute before both departed, leaving Russo and Banks alone in the dimly lit chamber. For a long while, neither spoke. The stars continued their indifferent watch. Finally, Banks leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. His gaze softened for a brief moment, as if recalling an unspoken history. "You'll need men who understand restraint, Nathan. I can't have this turning into open war. You've pulled us back from the edge before. Do it again." Russo's eyes softened for the first time that evening. "I know who to bring." Banks allowed the faintest flicker of trust to pass between them. "Take the UES Bulwark as your flagship. She's stationed in dry dock, but her crew's ready." Russo stood, his chair scraping lightly against the floor. "We'll depart before the Council finishes arguing." Banks exhaled slowly, nodding. "Bring them home, Nathan. I'll bring back whoever I can." Russo left without ceremony. Crew members lined the catwalks in silent observation, their gazes fixed on the departing ships. Many of them had served under Russo before, and though no words were exchanged, their salute was felt in the stillness of the hangar. Even those remaining behind understood. What lay ahead would leave its mark on every soul aboard. Inside the bridge, Russo watched the display screens flicker as nearby ships responded to the fleet's silent departure orders. Around him, the crew operated with precision, navigating the bulwark into open space. The ship was lean but well armed, its hull bearing the faint scars of past engagements, each marking a lesson learned, a price paid. Russo's second-in-command, Commander Holden, approached from the communications terminal. His short-cropped hair and the rigid way he carried himself spoke to years of frontline deployments, a man who treated every order as absolute. "Sir, the other vessels are forming up. 4 corvettes, 2 frigates, and a supply carrier, selected for rapid deployment and adaptability. Will be at full formation within the hour." Russo's eyes remained fixed on the viewport. The stars ahead drifted lazily as the fleet aligned into position. "Good. Maintain silent running until we breach the outer marker." Holden hesitated. "And if they engage before we arrive?" Russo's gaze didn't waver. "Then we break them apart until they stop." Holden gave a curt nod, vanishing into the depths of the ship to relay the orders. Alone once more, Russo folded his hands behind his back, watching as the void swallowed the bulwark whole, carrying humanity's quiet defiance into the dark. The transition from hyperspace was seamless, but the moment the UES bulwark emerged into real space, the bridge fell into a hushed stillness. Admiral Nathan Russo stood at the center of the command deck, arms crossed, eyes narrowing as the forward display unraveled the scene before them. "God help them," Commander Holden muttered under his breath, stepping closer to Russo's side. The sector stretched out in smoldering ruin. The largest colony, once marked by sprawling orbital habitats, was little more than fragmented wreckage drifting lazily above a scorched planet. Fires flickered across the dark surface below, tiny sparks of life clinging desperately in the aftermath of devastation. Flashes of light, far off near the edges of the system, indicated that the massacres were still underway. Amidst the drifting wreckage, civilian vessels listed at odd angles, some with entire sections sheared away, lifeboats still clinging to airlocks, untouched by the mercy they sought. "Scan the nearest debris field," Russo ordered, his voice cutting through the thick silence. "Scanning now," the sensor officer responded. Lines of data crawled across the screen. Radiation spikes, multiple ship signatures. Some civilian, but most are military. Coalition design. Russo's jaw tensed. He took a slow breath, nodding once. "Open a channel. Broadcast on all emergency frequencies." A brief pause followed, filled by the faint hum of the ship's systems. "Channel open, sir." "This is Admiral Nathan Russo of the United Earth Defense Fleet," Russo began, his voice unwavering. "To all coalition forces in this sector, disengage immediately. Humanitarian operations are now underway. Any further aggression against civilian populations will be met with force." Silence answered him. Holden leaned toward him. "They won't listen." Russo's gaze remained fixed on the screen. The bridge crew exchanged nervous glances as the seconds dragged by. "Sir," the comms officer interrupted the quiet. "Intercepted transmission from coalition forces. Audio only." "Play it." Static filled the channel before a gruff voice cut through. "You're wasting your breath, Admiral. These colonies were dead the moment they stood in our way. You can pick through the ashes if you like, but you won't find survivors." Holden shifted, clearly ready to respond, but Russo lifted a hand, silencing him. "This isn't a negotiation," Russo replied evenly. "If you refuse to stand down, we will remove you, one way or another." The line went dead. Holden let out a slow breath. "Orders." "We should hit them hard, Admiral," Holden pressed, his tone sharpening. "A message won't stop them. Not now." Russo's gaze lingered on the distant flashes of destruction. "It's not about stopping them," he replied, voice low. "It's about making sure they don't forget we were here." Russo's eyes narrowed as he watched another flash ripple along the planet's atmosphere, another orbital strike. "Intercept those gunships," Russo ordered. "Target the nearest frigate, focus fire on their engines. Cripple them, but leave the hulls intact. Let the survivors drift and watch." The bulwark shuddered as the first rail cannons powered up. The rest of the fleet followed suit, peeling away toward the scattered coalition vessels, like a pack of wolves closing in. Russo's gaze lingered on the display for a moment longer before turning to the crew. "Send out search and rescue teams once the sector is secure," he said. "Get civilians off those colonies. We'll hold position until every last one is safe." Holden's nod was sharp. "Understood, Admiral." The first rounds of fire erupted from the bulwark's cannons, bright against the emptiness of space. As the battle unfolded, Russo's thoughts drifted to the council chambers they had left behind, their empty words and hollow votes. They could debate morality. Humanity would take action. The silence of the sector didn't last. By the third day, reports began filtering through the UES Bulwark's communications relay. Isolated attacks, mining platforms gutted, refugee transports ambushed on exit trajectories. The coalition hadn't retreated. They were repositioning. Admiral Nathan Russo stood at the center of the bridge, arms crossed as he observed the tactical display flicker with incoming data. The curved holographic map outlined the vast expanse of the sector, dotted by the faint glimmers of the surviving colonies and the fractured wreckage orbiting the outer worlds. Now those glimmers were vanishing one by one. "They're testing us," Commander Holden muttered beside him, his brow furrowed as his eyes traced the pattern of disappearances. "Picking off anything that drifts too far from our coverage." Russo's gaze hardened. "They're not testing, Holden. They're warning us." The bridge crew exchanged quiet glances. The coalition's tactics had shifted overnight, and there was no doubt why. The human presence had upset the fragile balance of power, and now the response was coming. "Sir," the sensor officer called from his station. "Long-range probes detected a fleet movement along the outer belt. 26 vessels, heavy escort class, triple our numbers and growing. Additional energy signatures suggest capital ships in tow. They're advancing on the Juno trade route." Holden exhaled sharply. "That's a response fleet. They're coming for us." Russo straightened, his voice low but steady. "How long until they reach striking distance?" 16 hours, at their current speed." "Recall all patrols. Bring the fleet together at Point Epsilon," Russo ordered, stepping away from the display. "If they want to push us out, they'll have to come through everything we have." Holden hesitated. "Sir, that fleet outnumbers us 3-1. Russo's expression didn't shift. "Then we make them bleed for every inch." The ambush came not long after the fleet regrouped. The Bulwark drifted silently along the orbital plane of Juno's largest moon, her weapon systems running cold. Around her, the remaining corvettes and frigates maintained tight formations, engines at minimal output. The fleet was quiet, waiting. Russo stood on the observation deck, eyes locked on the void beyond. Somewhere out there, coalition ships were closing in. "Sir," Holden's voice filtered through the comm. "Scanners picking up distortions at the edge of the asteroid field. They're moving into formation." Russo nodded. "Hold positions. They'll come to us." The minutes stretched, each one heavier than the last. When the coalition vessels finally emerged, they did so in calculated waves. The lead formation swept forward, flanked by smaller interceptors that drifted like vultures around the larger cruisers. Russo's gaze narrowed. "They're trying to flush us out. Deploy the decoys." Holden relayed the command, and moments later, 3 modified supply freighters detached from the formation, their engine signatures spiking as they drifted into open space. They wouldn't last long, but they didn't need to. The coalition ships adjusted course immediately, their interceptors surging ahead. "Wait for it," Russo murmured, watching the tactical display. The interceptors accelerated, stretching the distance between themselves and the main fleet. "Now. Full burn. All ships, engage on my mark." The Bulwark's engines roared to life, her forward cannons illuminating the dark as they spat streams of tungsten at the incoming vessels. The lead interceptor burst apart, shattering into molten fragments that scattered across the formation. The second vessel banked hard to avoid the debris, but not before losing part of its starboard wing in the cascading explosion. Behind it, coalition frigates scattered, scrambling to recalibrate under the unexpected assault, The fleet followed. Corvettes weaved between coalition frigates, delivering precision strikes to engines and weapon bays. Frigates unleashed broadsides, battering shields until they flickered and collapsed. Russo's eyes never left the display. Target their support ships. Cripple the logistics. Holden's voice cut in. Sir, incoming transmission. Coalition command ship. Russo's lip curled faintly. Patch it through. Static filled the channel before a gravelly voice broke through. Your interference jeopardizes the stability of this sector, Admiral. Withdraw, and we will spare your remaining ships. Russo stepped closer to the comm panel. We're not here to negotiate terms with butchers. Pull your forces back, or we'll burn every warship you send. Silence. Then the channel cut. Holden exhaled. They're doubling down. Russo's expression didn't shift. Good. So are we. The battle stretched through the night cycle. Coalition reinforcements arrived, but so did more UED vessels. Silent, surgical strikes dismantled supply chains. Raider outposts burned in sudden bursts of fire that lit the cold edges of the sector. By the fifth day, the coalition began to fracture. Ships deserted, peeling away from the conflict without firing a shot. Those who remained fought harder, but the cracks were spreading. On the bridge of the bulwark, Holden stood by Russo's side, watching as another coalition cruiser drifted dark, its engines gutted by torpedo fire. They're breaking, Holden said quietly. Russo nodded, but not enough. Russo's grip on the console tightened. Letting up now would only delay the inevitable. He had seen enough sectors abandoned to know hesitation was just another form of surrender. He stepped forward, his gaze heavy as he addressed the crew. We keep the pressure on. This isn't over until they have nothing left to fight for. Holden's shoulders sagged slightly, but he said nothing. The crew around them moved with mechanical efficiency. No cheers, no relief. They understood. This wasn't victory. Not yet. The stars outside continued to burn, cold and indifferent to the war unraveling beneath them. The darkness of the asteroid field stretched endlessly before the fleet, a graveyard of shattered stations and drifting debris. Hidden among the crags of fractured rock, the UES Bulwark and her escort frigates lay in wait, their engines running cold to avoid detection. Admiral Nathan Russo stood at the edge of the bridge, arms clasped behind his back, watching the tactical map flicker with faint signatures from the coalition patrols. Surveillance probe returning, Commander Holden reported, his voice hushed, as if speaking louder would betray their position. It pinged a signal from one of their command vessels. Encrypted channel, tight frequency. Russo's eyes narrowed. Patch it through. I want to hear it. Holden relayed the order, and within moments, the transmission crackled to life across the bridge speakers. The audio was grainy, but the voices carried a weight that transcended the distortion. Wasting resources. The planets are scorched, and the asteroid belts are stripped bare. The speaker paused, his voice tinged with frustration. You promised plunder, not vengeance, but this is nothing but slaughter. Another voice, colder and harder, replied. Those colonies defied us. Their suffering is the message. Russo exchanged a glance with Holden, his expression hardening. The resources were never there, the first voice growled. You knew that from the start. This was personal. Silence followed. Then, the transmission cut abruptly. For a long moment, no one on the bridge spoke. Sir, Holden finally broke the silence. That wasn't just tactical misdirection. They're admitting this was never about territory. Russo exhaled slowly. Prepare the recording for broadcast. Ensure it reaches every coalition frequency. Holden hesitated, his brow furrowing. You're transmitting it directly. Won't that put us at greater risk? Risk or not, Russo said, his gaze fixed beyond the viewport. We end this today. When the transmission burst across the sector, it struck with the force of a missile. On coalition channels, the voices of their own commanders filled the comms, echoing across countless decks. In less than 3 minutes, the truth of the war unraveled, raw and undeniable. The bridge of the bulwark was silent as the crew listened. No cheers followed. No vindication. Holden's knuckles tightened against the edge of the console. This whole time, it was just hate. Russo stepped forward, his voice low. Hate is the bluntest weapon, and the easiest to turn against itself. The first signs appeared almost immediately. Coalition destroyers peeled away from formation, cutting their engines and drifting aimlessly into neutral space. Others held position but ceased firing, their commanders watching and waiting. "Sir," the sensor officer reported, "we're seeing deserters, multiple ships abandoning the front line." After the transmission ended, a faint communication leaked onto the open channel from one of the coalition frigates, hesitant, almost pleading. "Stand down. This isn't what we signed up for." Moments later, the vessel's engines powered down, drifting from formation. Holden glanced at Russo, the weight of the moment settling heavily between them. "Do we pursue?" Russo shook his head. "No, let them leave. There's no glory in hunting the disillusioned." A single coalition cruiser remained in the sector, engines burning as it repositioned to block the retreating vessels, its weapons powered up, targeting the defectors. Russo's jaw clenched as the coalition cruiser moved to intercept its own. His hand hovered over the console for a breath longer than necessary. "Holden! Fire!" The single word cut through the bridge like a blade, leaving no room for hesitation. The first volley struck the coalition vessel's rear thrusters, severing its propulsion and sending it adrift. Within moments, its remaining escorts scattered. "They're fleeing, sir." Holden's voice carried a note of grim satisfaction. Russo exhaled, watching as the stars reclaimed the battlefield. "Good. Let them run. We've done enough here." He stepped back, the weight of command heavier than ever, but for the first time, he felt the tide shifting. Not from superiority of arms, but from the simplest weapon humanity had ever wielded: the truth. The aftermath of the transmission lingered in the silence of the bridge. The stars beyond the viewport shimmered indifferently, but the tension in the air was palpable. Admiral Nathan Russo stood with his hands clasped behind his back, eyes fixed on the tactical display as new data filtered in. "Sir," Commander Holden's voice broke the stillness, "we're tracking multiple coalition vessels altering course. 3 heavy cruisers and 2 frigates are withdrawing from the front lines. No indication they're regrouping." Russo's gaze remained steady. "They're done fighting." Holden exhaled quietly. "It's spreading, Admiral. We're picking up more signals. Smaller factions are peeling away. One of their support ships just signaled emergency retreat coordinates." "They're not our concern," Russo replied, though his tone softened slightly. "Let them run." The display flickered as ships disappeared from the grid, but not all of them. A dense cluster of hostile signatures held position beyond the asteroid field. Those that remained burned brighter, forming into tighter formations. Holden studied the tactical readout, frowning. Some are holding. Reinforcements from the core systems are pushing forward. Russo's lips pressed into a thin line. Fanatics. The coalition wasn't shattering as cleanly as he had hoped. Some commanders, either driven by hatred or fear of showing weakness, weren't retreating. If anything, they were advancing. "Send a general broadcast," Russo ordered, "to all ships that have disengaged or are considering withdrawal." Holden nodded, activating the comms. "Channel open, Admiral." Russo took a breath, stepping closer to the communications panel. His voice, calm but unyielding, resonated across open channels. "To those who have chosen to leave this war behind, stay the course. We do not seek further conflict. If you cannot stand with us, stand aside. Let this end here." He signaled Holden to cut the feed. "They'll listen," Russo said quietly, though he wasn't certain if the reassurance was meant for Holden or himself. The response came hours later, not in words, but in actions. One by one, civilian convoys began appearing along the outer markers of the sector, gliding through previously contested corridors unchallenged. Coalition escorts, battered and weary, flanked them without firing a shot. "Sir, we're receiving unmarked cargo signatures inbound," Holden reported. No identification, but they match coalition supply vessels. They're on approach vectors. Russo raised an eyebrow. Scans. Humanitarian supplies, medical gear, rations, and construction materials. Russo nodded slowly. Silent reparations. They're trying to save face. Holden smirked. I'll take what I can get. Despite the small victories, the coalition's core forces remained entrenched, and their formation around the primary colony worlds only solidified. They're not breaking formation, Holden noted grimly. They won't, Russo replied. Not all of them. The third day after the broadcast brought the first open defection. A light cruiser, the Cravon's Edge, severed communications with the coalition flagship and crossed into human-controlled space without provocation. Its commander, a weathered veteran named Harlan Voss, transmitted a brief message before docking with the UES Bulwark. They're bleeding out, Admiral, Voss said during the closed-door debriefing. His eyes carried the weight of countless battles. Their leadership won't admit it, but the coalition is crumbling. They'll double down, but not everyone will follow. Russo regarded him carefully. And why did you? Voss shrugged, his expression hardening. I didn't sign up to slaughter civilians. Some of us haven't forgotten what war is supposed to be. The defection sparked more cracks in the coalition's armor. By the end of the week, at least 4 additional ships defected or went silent, refusing to follow orders. Yet, as the coalition fractured, the remaining hardliners became more aggressive. The reports of civilian massacres dwindled, but skirmishes along the outer colonies increased. Small ambushes, desperate and savage. Russo watched as the conflict shifted into something smaller, but no less dangerous. This wasn't about grand fleets or strategic strikes anymore. It was attrition. Holden, Russo said quietly as they reviewed the latest intelligence. Increase long-range patrols along the trade routes. If they can't break us with numbers, they'll try bleeding us dry. Yes, sir. Russo lingered at the viewport long after Holden departed, watching the empty stars. The coalition was coming apart, but the war wasn't over, not yet. But for the first time, Russo could see the cracks widening, and that was enough to keep pushing forward. The distant glow of the coalition's last stronghold shimmered against the black canvas of space. From the bridge of the UES Bulwark, Admiral Nathan Russo watched as the station's silhouette drifted into view, surrounded by the debris of shattered escorts and crippled defense platforms. This is their final redoubt, Commander Holden said, standing to Russo's left. Scans show heavy fortifications, surface batteries, torpedo platforms, and shield generators across all major sectors. Russo's eyes narrowed, tracing the defensive patterns flickering across the holo display. The station was a fortress, but it stood alone. The coalition's core fleets were gone, deserters or defectors, leaving behind only the fanatics. They've dug in, Holden continued, his tone grim. They know what's coming. Let them know, Russo replied evenly. Deploy the fleet to appear scattered but ready to tighten. Leave a narrow gap. Let them think they can break out. When they come, we'll close it behind them. The bridge crew moved with precision, issuing silent commands through flickering control panels. The bulwark drifted forward, leading a wedge of Allied ships, frigates, corvettes, and defected coalition cruisers now bearing UED transponders. They maneuvered in formation, forming a noose around the isolated station. By the time the station's defense grid came fully online, the trap had already closed. Coalition station broadcasting, the comms officer reported. Encrypted signal, but no demands. It's static. Background encryption scrambling. Holden arched an eyebrow. They're not asking for help? They know no one's coming, Russo replied. He stepped forward, folding his arms behind his back. Patch me through to their command deck. Seconds later, the central display shimmered to life. The distorted visage of Commander Draxil filled the screen, framed by flickering control lights behind him. His face bore the weight of exhaustion, but his eyes burned with defiance. This is Admiral Nathan Russo of the United Earth Defense Fleet, Russo began, his voice calm but deliberate. Your coalition has fallen. The fleets that once defended you have either fled or joined us. You stand alone. The alien's gaze sharpened. We will not surrender. If humanity thinks it can erase us, you're mistaken. Russo didn't blink. I'm not here to erase you. I'm here to end this. Lower your shields, power down your weapons, and we will ensure the safety of your civilians. Resist, and no one leaves. Silence stretched across the channel. The alien's gaze wavered for a fleeting moment before hardening once more. We would rather die here than kneel to earth. The screen blinked out. Holden exhaled sharply, tension gripping the air. That's a no. Russo straightened. Tighten the blockade. Begin long-range bombardment of their outer defenses, slow and precise, no unnecessary casualties. The bulwark's rail cannons spun to life, sending shimmering rounds through the void. The first impacts flared against the station's outer shielding, rippling bursts of light cascading across its hull. One by one, the outer defense turrets dimmed, swallowed by explosions that flickered and died in silence. They're holding fire, Holden noted, his voice quieter. They're not even retaliating. They know better, Russo replied. His eyes remained locked on the display, watching as the station slowly drifted further into isolation. But the longer they wait, the weaker they become. As the bombardment continued, no further signals came from the station. The siege had begun, and Russo knew it was only a matter of time before the weight of isolation broke them. The siege had stretched into its second day when the first tremors of coalition resistance shattered the calm. Sensors on the UES bulwark registered the sudden surge of heat signatures emerging from the station's dark side. They're launching, Commander Holden announced, his eyes locked onto the tactical display. Multiple strike wings, fighters and bombers, cruisers moving to intercept. Admiral Nathan Russo didn't flinch. His gaze followed the blinking red triangles sweeping toward their position. Let them come, Russo said, his voice low. Order all ships to defensive positions. Keep tight formations. Make them bleed for every meter. The coalition's assault unfolded in staggered waves, fighters screaming through the void as frigates and destroyers pushed forward behind them. The bulwark's forward batteries roared to life, tearing through the first line of interceptors, but more swarmed in their place. Focus fire on their lead cruiser, Russo commanded, eyes narrowing as the largest vessel closed the distance. Cut off their advance. The railguns of the fleet locked onto the cruiser, bright flashes erupting along its hull as coordinated strikes ripped through armor plating. The coalition ship staggered, venting atmosphere, but pressed on. They're desperate, Holden muttered, throwing everything at us. Russo's lips thinned. Desperation makes them dangerous. Stay sharp. The clash intensified, the bulwark weaving through barrages of plasma fire as Allied frigates circled and struck from flanking positions. One corvette peeled away in flames, gutted by torpedoes, but the line held. As the coalition pressed harder, the trap began to close. Now, Russo ordered, his hand tightening around the edge of the console. Signal the secondary fleet. Flank them from the debris field. Holden relayed the order, and moments later, additional UED vessels emerged from behind the wreckage that littered the sector. Coalition forces, overextended and exposed, found themselves encircled. Cut off their retreat. Force them toward the station, Russo said, eyes fixed on the dwindling gaps in their formation. We finish this here. The coordinated counterattack pushed the coalition's surviving vessels back toward their fortress. Russo stepped forward as the station filled the view screen. Commander, prepare strike teams, Russo said. We're boarding that station, Holden blinked. Sir, their defenses, they're fractured, Russo interrupted. We hit their reactor and end this. The boarding teams launched under the cover of sustained bombardment. As Russo had anticipated, the coalition's defenses crumbled under pressure. Automated turrets flickered and died as the strike teams breached the outer hull. Inside the station, the corridors burned with flickering emergency lights as Russo's forces advanced. The Rita chamber loomed ahead, but resistance thickened the closer they drew to the core. "Push through," Russo ordered, his voice cold over comms. "They won't hold." His prediction proved true. The defenders faltered as the humans advanced relentlessly. Within minutes, Russo's men stood before the reactor control terminal. "Detonate the failsafes," Russo commanded. "Detonation set," Holden confirmed, a note of grim satisfaction in his voice. Russo watched the countdown flicker across the console. He didn't look away as the reactor pulsed, as if giving the station one final breath. "We did what we had to," he thought. But the ache in his chest lingered. This was victory, but it had come at a cost none of them would forget. As the strike teams evacuated, the station trembled. A deep rumble shook the void as the reactor overloaded, igniting the structure from within. The Coalition's final bastion erupted in a silent burst of fire and light. From the bridge of the bulwark, Russo watched as debris scattered into the blackness. The last Coalition warships broke formation, fleeing into hyperspace. "Let them go," Russo said softly. Holden exhaled. "It's over." But Russo didn't respond. His eyes remained fixed on the smoldering wreckage, the weight of every decision heavy in his chest. There were no cheers on the bridge, only silence. The conference chamber aboard the UES bulwark was cold and unadorned. A long table stretched across its center, flanked by sparse chairs that remained half-empty. A handful of Coalition representatives filed in slowly, their expressions drawn and distant. Scars from the last battle were evident even here, uniforms frayed, exhaustion hanging over them like a cloak. Admiral Nathan Russo stood at the head of the table, hands resting lightly against the cold surface. His eyes tracked each delegate as they took their seats, noting the hesitation in their movements. There was no defiance left, only the hollow remnants of leadership worn thin by defeat. Commander Holden entered last, sealing the chamber doors behind him. He took his place at Russo's right, quietly unfolding a datapad to record the proceedings. Russo cleared his throat. "Let's begin." The hum of the ship's systems filled the silence that followed. No one spoke. The weight of their collective failure lingered in the air, as if acknowledging it aloud would shatter the fragile ceasefire. Russo allowed the pause to stretch, watching the gathered delegates shift uncomfortably. Finally, one of the alien representatives, Consul Darek, an elder with elongated features and deep-set amber eyes, his skin a pale gray with subtle ridges along his scalp, leaned forward. "What terms do you demand, Admiral?" Darek asked, his voice gravelly and edged with resignation. Russo straightened. "No demands. This isn't a surrender. It's a path forward." A murmur rippled through the room, quiet but palpable. "The war is over," Russo continued, his tone even but firm. "Your extremists fought to the last, and they are gone. What remains of your fleets are fractured, but your people still endure. Our role here is to ensure that continues." One of the younger representatives, Consul Avarn, short, stocky, with hardened blue scales and piercing yellow eyes, narrowed his gaze. "And in return, you take control of our systems?" Russo met his gaze without flinching. "No. Humanity will not occupy your worlds. We will provide protection while your colonies rebuild. Nothing more. We came to prevent a tragedy, not expand our borders. I understand your hesitation, but no one needs to disappear today. Trust isn't rebuilt overnight. Neither is peace." The room fell silent again, save for the soft tapping of Holden's fingers against the datapad. Another delegate, Consul Tarsik, a tall, gaunt figure with a crest of dull red spines running along his head and neck, shifted forward. The ridges along his brow creased as he studied Russo. "You could claim all of it, every world, every colony. No one here could stop you." Russo's expression hardened. "That's not why we're here." Holden finally spoke, his voice quieter, but cutting through the tension. "You've seen enough war. So have we. This sector needs stability, not more conquest." Several of the delegates exchanged glances. For the first time, Russo saw something beyond wariness, reluctant hope, fragile, but flickering beneath their weariness. "We'll draft the formal terms for reconstruction," Russo continued, his voice calm but resolute. "Humanitarian aid will arrive within the week. Patrol fleets will remain until your own defenses are re-established. After that, the sector governs itself." Darek folded his hands before him, nodding slowly. "It will take time." Russo inclined his head. "Time is something we can afford to give." No celebration followed, no cheers or handshakes. One by one, the delegates stood and exited the chamber, their footsteps heavy as they disappeared into the corridors beyond. One of them paused at the door, casting a final glance over his shoulder at Russo before vanishing into the corridor. When the last of them had gone, Holden powered down the data pad. He glanced at Russo. It felt quiet. Russo exhaled, the weight of command settling over him once more. "Victory doesn't always need to be loud, Holden. Sometimes, silence is the only thing that fits." Holden nodded and left the chamber without another word. Alone, Russo remained at the head of the table, his gaze fixed on the empty chairs. The war had ended, but the echoes of its consequences would stretch far beyond the battlefield. One final duty remained. The Council would need to hear what had been done, and what had been spared. The Galactic Council chamber was as imposing as Nathan Russo remembered. Towering columns framed the circular hall, and faint beams of light filtered down from the high ceiling, illuminating the polished stone floor. Rows of elevated seats, occupied by representatives from countless worlds, formed a half-circle around the central podium. Russo adjusted his uniform as he stepped onto the docking platform, the UES bulwark looming silently behind him. Chancellor Giancarlo Banks descended beside him, the faint hum of the station systems the only sound between them. Their return to the Galactic Council felt heavier this time. Though the war had ended, the weight of its consequences followed them. Holden met them at the entrance to the station's main corridor. "The Council's waiting, sir. No formal reception." Banks smirked. "I didn't expect one." They walked the long path toward the Council chamber in silence, the echoes of their footsteps following closely. Russo glanced around at the faces lining the station's causeways, diplomats, officers, workers, all watching the two men pass with quiet curiosity. By the time they reached the chamber, the doors opened without ceremony. The faint hum of conversation faded as the councillors turned to face them. Banks took the lead, stepping to the forefront of the podium, while Russo stood a half-step behind him. The councillors' gazes bore down on them, some with thinly veiled skepticism, others with curiosity, and a rare few with grudging respect. Banks clasped his hands behind his back and let the silence stretch for a moment longer before speaking. "Members of the Council," his voice echoed with a quiet authority, "the war in the outer sector is over." A ripple of hushed murmurs passed through the chamber, but Banks pressed on, unshaken. "We intervened not to expand our borders, but to prevent the extinction of a species targeted by their own neighbors. The extremist factions that drove this conflict are no more. What remains of the coalition stands on the edge of survival and rebuilding." Russo's gaze shifted across the faces of the council members. Consul Threx of the Ravos Dominion sat rigid, his silvered eyes narrow beneath the hood of his ceremonial robes. Across from him, Consul Geran, the feline-like envoy from the Velkar Syndicate, regarded them with a cool, unreadable stare. "You acted without this council's authorization," Threx's voice cut through the air, sharp as a blade. "Such intervention could have ignited greater conflict. Humanity risked the stability of entire sectors." Russo took a step forward, his voice calm but firm. "Risking nothing would have guaranteed the slaughter of millions. We chose action." A brief silence followed before Banks spoke again, his gaze locking onto Threx. "You turned away. We did not. And now, because of that choice, this galaxy is a little less fractured." Jaren's eyes flicked to the side, his tail curling lazily as he considered the statement. Some of the counselors shifted in their seats, but none spoke to oppose him. Banks exhaled softly, letting his next words hang with deliberate weight. This was not a display of power. It was a defense of principle. We claim no territory, take no spoils. The outer colonies remain under their own governance, and we leave with nothing but the knowledge that another race endures. Russo watched as the murmurs quieted, replaced by a stillness that felt heavier than disapproval. Finally, Sharon leaned forward, resting his hands on the edge of the council's desk. His golden eyes locked with Banks's. "No spoils," he repeated, almost as if testing the words. "Only the blood you spent to preserve them." Banks's expression did not shift. "There are victories that cannot be measured by spoils, Consul Geron. Perhaps one day this council will recognize them for what they are." The chamber grew still once more.
Some counselors lowered their gazes, unwilling to meet Banks's eyes. Others regarded Russo and Banks with subtle nods of acknowledgement. Without waiting for further deliberation, Banks turned from the podium, his stride measured and deliberate. Russo followed, his steps echoing in sync. As they reached the outer corridor, Holden was waiting for them, datapad in hand. His eyes flickered to Banks. "I take it they weren't quick to offer gratitude." Banks allowed a faint smirk.
"I didn't ask for it." Russo glanced over his shoulder, catching a final glimpse of the silent chamber. "They know the truth. That's enough." Holden fell into step beside them as they walked the long path back toward the docking bay. No applause followed them. No ceremonies marked their return. But as they departed, the weight in Russo's chest felt just a little lighter. Hey there again. I'm glad you've come so far. Hope you enjoyed the video. Remember to hit the like button and the subscribe button. This is really important to the channel. Really important. And I have one more thing for you. I've chosen another video for you to watch. Just click the card here, or here if you want the whole playlist. See you there.